June 17th, 2008. Would you please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. There are a couple of announcements before we start today's meeting. There's nothing to report on the following two closed sessions held last week, June 10th. A closed session held pursuant to Government Code Section 54956.9B1, Conference with Legal Counsel, Anticipated Litigation, and Significant Exposure to Litigation, one case. And second, a closed session held pursuant to Government Code 54956.9, Conference with Legal Counsel, regarding existing litigation, County of Calaveras versus Teton Fly Reels Incorporated, Calaveras Superior Court Case number CV 33770.
Come on, I gotta get that one. Where are my papers?
We will now move to the consent calendar, consent agenda, which is items that are expected to be routine and non-controversial. They'll be acted upon the board at one time without discussion. Anybody in this room can remove this for discussion, remove any item from the consent agenda. Any members of the supervisors?
Okay, let me look at it. No, I do not.
All right, staff?
Mr. Chairman, I would like an explanation of item 7.
Okay, we'll remove item 7 from the consent calendar. And is there anybody from the public that wishes to remove any item? Do I hear a motion on the ballot?
So move.
Second.
Motion and a second. Those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Passes on a 4-0, 1 absent. Item number 7.
Good morning, Michael Walker, Undersheriff. Item number 7 comes to you. This is the contract with California Forensic Medical Group. This is the provider that provides medical services within the jail. This contract is due to expire the end of this month. This would continue the contract for a minimum of another year for a set amount of $359,279.04.
Okay, Sheriff Walker, the thing that caught my eye here was on the under discussion. It talks about the process to continue to obtain the best services available at a competitive rate. This implies that there was no competitive bidding on this particular contract. Is that?
There is no other provider at this time. When we move to a larger facility, then we open up into new markets for providers to bid on this contract. At this time, California Forensic Medical Group is the only game in town.
Really? This may be bordering on a silly question, but with a hospital across the street, there's no way that we can work out any kind of an arrangement with their facility?
Prior to going to California Forensic Medical Group, we did contract with a local physician who had a PA that worked in his office that would come over to the jail once a week. The cost of that program, the insurance, and the liability to the county was deemed to be too high, and that's when we went to California Forensic Medical Group.
Okay. Well, I would just encourage you to, I know that the administration of that hospital is getting much more aggressive about looking for innovative ways to add to their bottom line. So I would encourage you to make an outreach to them. So,
okay.
Mr. Chairman, I move this item.
Second.
Motion and a second. Those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Passes on 4-0 to 1 absent. We will now take a 2-minute recess and then open at 9:10 for public comment. As soon as Supervisor Thomas returns to his seat. Okay, we're now on agenda item number 10. This is public comments, where we request that members of the public speak for no more than 5 minutes and that no topic take more than 15 minutes, although we've had occasional exceptions to that. But please come forward and state your name and sign in.
Hello, I am Diane Gray from the Calaveras County Chamber of Commerce, and I wanted to bring you up to date on the Economic Development Summit that we have planned on for July 11th and 12th. And you know, we're doing this together with the county and the City of Angels and the Chamber of Commerce. And it's a full day-and-a-half event where we have speakers and breakout sessions to talk about, you know, economic development and develop the framework for moving forward and having some action steps to encourage economic development. So I'm asking you guys, though, if you could help us fund this project and this summit. The City of Angels has already agreed to support this with a donation of $1,000. And, excuse me, and the Chamber of Commerce doesn't have, you know, a huge budget. So we were asking if you could perhaps help us pay for the summit. And maybe Supervisor Walensky has already agreed to put some money out of his discretionary funds for that. So I was hoping I could count on you guys to help us out in this way.
A couple things. Number one, that's probably appropriate for preliminary budget, which starts on the 24th of June. The second is I think there is support on the board for some form of an economic element within the general plan update process. The board has allocated money for the general plan update process, and maybe Bob can have his office look and see if perhaps it might be appropriate to make some allocation from the general plan process to this, with the intent that it help frame an economic element for the general plan update. But you know, those are my thoughts. I don't know where the rest of the board is.
Anybody else like to comment on this?
Well, those are both good ideas.
I didn't hear what you said, Phil.
Those are both excellent ideas.
Okay.
I'm very much inclined to allocate some funds out of my discretionary funds for that effort too. That this is more than a broad brush economic element effort. This is going to be targeted to bringing people in that have had some measured success or measurable success in bringing economic vitality to various places. And so I think that we can certainly glean some information from this effort that will be beneficial in our respective districts. So I think I can certainly justify it in my mind. How much were you thinking about?
500.
Yeah,
That would be good, but as soon as possible.
Yeah, it's the
Procedure,
timing.
we now need to agendize those. But as long as you have the funds committed, it would be difficult for you to count on those. I don't see any problem with that issue being passed here, but that has to go through that process.
I think the issue is procuring speakers and making sure that they've got the capacity to get their transportation and other
Right.
expenses
Basically, we're charging a small fee of $25 for people to attend, and we've had some people sign up, but that really just covers the basic costs of the food and rental of the high school for the day and so on. We have over 50 speakers lined up, including panels and moderators and things like that. And we do have a couple of potentially really great, like one really great speaker, which we would have to cover the travel costs. And so, and then beyond that, you know, just printing and postage is significant in today's world. And so if you could, that would be terrific.
And I might suggest Rita's available by email if admin could contact her and ask if she would like to participate so that she'll know about this.
And if we could agendize this in a timely way so that it can benefit the event before it happens.
Yeah, right.
Be a good thing.
Those bills are already rolling in. Great.
All right.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else from the public wish to step forward?
Good morning, Board. My name is Franziska Schabram. I'm living on 3206 Gilm Road. As you might recall, I have standing here before a half year ago and told you about the terrible condition Gilm Road is in. Now, the last rainy season has passed, and I have to tell you nothing happened to the road. I figured maybe one voice of the citizen isn't enough, so I started to talk to my immediate neighbors about the condition of the road. And all of us had the same concerns and the same fears that in the case of an emergency, this road is calling for a disaster. But what I also learned about the road is that it started a long time ago. Let me summarize. First, there was a bridge that was repaired and then had to be torn down again, and this has cost the taxpayers money, already a large sum of money. The same individual who initialized that found the red-legged frog. It's believed to extinct for so many times. We discussed that all and over again. Even we have witnesses who are willing to testify that the frog was planted. I was told once the animal is there, it doesn't matter anymore. We have to deal with the fact. That puts everything what I know about right and wrong in a totally different perspective. You're telling me you do something illegal, you create a situation, and then a whole neighborhood has to suffer under this situation. It can't be an environmental issue because my husband, we own a 220-acre ranch. We already offered to put a large part of our ranch besides to protect whatever is out there. We would even put the ranch into a conservation easement, but that doesn't seem to matter to anybody. The only concern is this little dusty road with a couple of potholes. Further, the road is narrowed in by private persons, so narrow that emergency vehicles will have a big time to go through there. Passing that road each other would be nearly impossible. When we did our private road on our land, we had to follow certain codes, and your inspectors made sure that that codes were obeyed. Why doesn't the law appear to everybody, especially on a public road? And last and not least, the county is not even allowed to put gravel in one of the potholes. Yet, that individual is working big equipment on his property next to the endangered species habitat, major trenching, and again, I'm flabbergasted. Nobody seems to care about that fact. It comes always back to the road. Today I'm standing here before you and I would like to have some answers to my questions. Why are communities like Cosgrove Creek, Paloma, Double Springs, Gilm Road put in so much danger just for a request of one individual to put a public road down? I have a little bit the feeling that the county doesn't care much of the need of their people. I feel kind of a nuisance to the county. I'll give you one example of what happened to me. Last work, I left a couple of voice messages with the Public Work Department. None of these messages were returned. Finally, I went down on Friday, and believe me, I'm not expecting when I show up at the city office, I'm not that important person that I think everybody should let his pen fall and pay attention to me. I would have expected to get an appointment. But instead, I was told the head of the department is not in the house. 2 minutes later, the head of the department comes out of a door next to that counter. A public paid servant who avoids the public, I feel so bad about that. But actually, I would like to finish my speech here today on a positive note. My supervisor, Bill Claudino, is so far the only person I could always count on. He always returns my calls, and he is always an ear for me and the people who have elected him. Because he is my representative today here, I would like to present him a letter by 49 citizens, what represents at least 3 times the amount of people. It represents 40 houses and livestock. So you can imagine how much monetary money is in that. And all feel the same. Our voice has not been heard. We are put in gravely danger. And I'm asking why. And I'm asking not only you the question today, I will ask the grand jury that question. And I want to have a thoroughly investigation in that matter. I hope the people's voice will be heard this time. let me present the letter and the signature I gathered. Thank you very much for the time you gave me. Thank you.
Thank you, Francis.
Thank you.
Francis, your concerns are that of the county, and this has been an unbelievable journey to try to get your road repaired. It is a public road. It's been that for 150 years. I've used it personally for 40 years. We have had some difficulties with state and federal agencies. Contact with them is often frustrating, but I have asked the Director of Public Works to come here today and to address the issues that you spoke about. And actually, I'd like to have Mike Miller come up here now and address those issues.
Good morning. Mike Miller, Public Works Director. By the request of Board Member Claudino, I put a time frame together on the situation that we have on Gillum Road. Similar to the situation we have on Cosgrove Creek. It's a red-legged frog habitat, but also on Gillum Road there's an elderberry beetle. So we're restricted in doing work. Last February, I asked a consultant service to put together a scope of work for us to get us permits to repair Gillum Road. I received that proposal on March 13th. They were proposing to charge us $58,000 to submit the necessary applications to get a permit with no guarantee of getting the permit. I called a consultant firm and said it was ridiculous for me to go to my board and ask them to authorize the expenditure of $58,000 with no guarantees of a permit. Both the people that were at that consultant firm have subsequently left and gone to another firm. We decided early in May to take this back on in-house ourselves and at least pursue to get the road fixed. I went out with the superintendent of roads, I think it was the last week in May. We assessed the road. He went out 2 days later and spray painted the road and took pictures and did a narrative to submit a letter to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. That went to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, I believe, on June 9th. Yesterday, I forwarded to you an email that came back from U.S. Fish and Wildlife that said everything appears to be in order. There's a couple more things we need, and then you'll be able to do your temporary work. That's where we stand on this. But I want you to understand that a week ago Monday, Mrs. Scherbaum and Lori Oliver from Farm Bureau did visit with me. Monday is the only day I'm here for the next few weeks. I do not work the balance of the week. I came back from lunch. The people that work at the front counter do not track me. There's only one person that accounts for my well-being, and that's Tonette White, my secretary. The people at the front counter don't know when I come. They don't know when I go. They came back. They said, we have people at the front counter that want to see you. And I said, I can't see them. I'm booked all day. She came back. She said, they're insisting. I said, fine. I spent, I think, the bulk of the lunch hour on that Monday with both of them. I walked them through this whole process. I gave them a copy of this consultant proposal and said, in good conscience, I cannot go to my board and ask for this money, and that's why we've taken this back in-house. But just so you know, I know the regulators get beat up over these things. Everybody's pointing to Corps of Engineers and U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and I repeatedly have told people, these are people that work in government that are obligated to follow the law. They don't have the latitude to make decisions when legislation has been passed for the requirements. In the case of this proposal for Gillum Road, the consultant estimated that we would need a principal engineer for 48 hours, an archaeologist for 113 hours, an environmental scientist for 197 hours, a biologist for 44 hours, a hydrologist for 20 hours, and a GIS specialist for 38 hours just to complete the application process to do the temporary work out there. This does not even take into consideration a realignment of the road in the future, and it focuses primarily on a very small creek called Young's Creek, which is a tributary, which is where this frog allegedly resides. So we are on top of this. It has taken a long time. This is not something that sits on the back burner. It's in the work process with everything else. And I just want to let you know that we are on it, and as soon as we're out there patching, you'll know. You'll get a note from us via email. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to respond.
Mike, did the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, in their latest communication just a few days ago, did they indicate any timeline? I mean, according to what you told me, if I understand correctly, they're looking at this temporary fix to make the road passable as having complied with what they want us to comply with. So
they're going to give us permission to do temporary repairs in there on the areas that we've identified in the submittal that we made to them on June 9th. We photograph it. They'll determine which areas we can work on. The one area they may not permit us to work on is the bridge approach to Young's Creek. But everything else looks like they'll be able to let us work on it. This is not a permanent fix. This is a temporary fix, and I can't even give you any estimate on how long it would take to get a permanent fix out there.
So is there any way that we can estimate when even the temporary fix may commence?
I would hope in the next couple of weeks. I mean, the email that we got yesterday that I forwarded to you said it looked like pretty much everything was in order.
So for a permanent fix, you're saying that we're going to have to go back to some environmental review that may
Certainly.
May involve the time and specialists that you were just.
We may use some of their services. I don't know that we can find the money in the budget to hire all these services, but if we can get the temporary fixes made, then we can start the process for the permanent fix. The permanent fix, what they're asking us to do is to find a way that the rock will no longer be displaced from the road into the adjacent creeks. Well, every time we repair the road and put more base rock down, when it rains and it floods in the winter, it displaces that rock into the creek. Now they're asking us to find a way to remove the rock without being disrupting to the habitat in the creek. That may even involve a large commercial-style vacuum truck, which is called a Sanivac, to suck the rock out. I mean,
I guess the idea would get. I can't even say this with a straight face. The idea would not fly that the reason the red-legged frog is there after all these 150 years is because of the type of maintenance we've been doing for 150 years. That wouldn't work, would it?
Up till 2004, it's my understanding that this was a very well-maintained dirt road.
It was.
And then I believe that after that, and maybe in early 2006, they had a storm, and the storm essentially washed most of the rock off the road and displaced it in the creek.
Okay. So you expect to make this road
passable?
Passable.
That would be the best I could describe it, passable.
And we're looking at that very soon.
I would hope so.
Thank you. And Francis, do you keep those cards and letters coming?
Can I comment just one? What I think is lacking here is, and you have been on that corner when we discussed the whole issue with, we were told, and this is more than a year ago, by the head of Army Corps of Engineers, this is not a big deal anymore, you recall, Bill, this is just, it needs an informal letter and then we can go forward. That was one and a half year ago. Where is the common sense here, Bill? Where is the common sense? If I hear that number as a taxpayer, it cringes me. Laws are made to protect people, not hurt people. This is to put the law upside down. You know what happened here? A well-meant law is turned into a private interest group and against the people. And I'm not willing to take that anymore. Where is the common sense?
All right, thank you, Francis.
Hello, Lori Oliver with Calaveras County Farm Bureau.
One moment. Generally speaking, we do have a rule here to turn the cell phones on to vibrate or off altogether for precisely the reason that you just experienced. But now I imagine you can speak without interruption.
Okay, I have a couple questions probably directed at Mike. We have progress with Fish and Wildlife Services. I would like to know what the status is with the Army Corps of Engineers.
The Army Corps of Engineers has jurisdiction over about half of this area of the roadway. The other half, they're just required to consult with U.S. Fish and Wildlife to make sure that the issues related to the environment have been addressed. When the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service agrees that those have been addressed, they tell the Army Corps of Engineers, and the Army Corps of Engineers will give us a temporary permit to move in there and do temporary work.
Thank you.
Okay, so I understand that once we get clearance from Fish and Wildlife, we also have it from the Army Corps.
Excuse me, could you identify yourself?
Lori Oliver from the Calaveras County Farm Bureau.
Thank you.
Is that correct? Okay. And that is the nationwide permit we're looking for to get that work done?
No, that's not a nationwide permit. This is a temporary permit to do the temporary fix to the road.
Okay. Then let's go back to the rerouting of the road. I'm a little bit confused as what is that going to accomplish? Are we going to face the same challenges by rerouting that road and such?
What she's referring to is there's a property owner on Gillum Road who has offered, and I don't know if there's a legal document available or not, to allow the realignment of the road away from the existing area and across the far side of the pasture, tying back in just beyond his property. I know there were estimates done for a project on what it would take to build a new road around that area, but I have no idea what it would take to go through the regulatory process to build that new road. I don't know if there's elderberry beetles or frogs or anything else on the other end of this pasture. All we're focusing on right now is to try and get this road passable again. If there's a long-term fix and that requires the dedication of land, I'm sure that would take us quite some time to do.
Thank you again.
I apologize for the cell phone.
Oh, that's...
My name is Margaret Jansen. I'm here with my husband, Charles. And this is regarding the Trinitas program. And I submitted our letter earlier when I came in. I would like to read it to you, if I may. Supervisor Cladino, we live next to the Trinitas project on Center Drive and are writing to you regarding some serious concerns about keeping it rural, which is Kerr. It seems like they are using residents in our neighborhood to stop the Trinitas project, when a lot of the neighbors actually support the project. In August of last year, Kerr, Lou and Kathy Mayhew and Donald Kuhn filed papers claiming that 32 residents in our neighborhood were having water problems due to the golf course. On this list, Kerr named us. Charles and Margaret Jansen were number 14. We submitted that as well, as one of the 9 residents on the list that had drilled new wells. We would like to request the public record to be corrected to reflect the following. 1, we never drilled a new well. We replaced a pump due to old age. 2, we told them that we were in favor of the project and never gave them Mayhews or Kerr permission to use our name on this list. 3, we never agreed to participate in hiring an attorney. 4, we never gave them any money. 5, like many other neighbors, we support this project for all the good things that can do for our area in these difficult economic times. We and our neighbors did attend Kerr meetings. We thought it was an understanding, to get an understanding of the county process and the EIR. We never thought we would be used in this way. We have recently spoken to other neighbors who were also represented on the list, and it seems like there is a pattern. We would suggest looking closely into any documents filed by Lou and Kathy Mayhew, Donald Kerr, or Keep It Rural. They appear to be intentionally representing neighbors and facts to try to destroy Trinitas and keep it from being approved. In short, we support any property owner's right to develop their own property, as long as it does not impact the surrounding areas, as in water, traffic, noise, or taxes. Thank you for your time. Margaret Jansen.
Thank you.
My name's Gary Stockland. I also have a letter concerning the Trinitas golf project. Supervisor Cladino, our names are Gary and Elisa Stockland. We live in your district on Center Drive next to the Trinitas project. We are very upset because we recently learned that our names were included as members of Keep It Rural in their problem well list. On the list, Lou and Kathy Mayhew and Donald Kuhn state that we are number 20 and that we put in a new well because of Trinitros. We specifically told this group that we are not having problems and that we replaced an old pump 12 years ago. We did not put in a new well. We attended a letter writing meeting hosted by the Keep It Rural, and we signed a letter. We thought the letter was asking the county to make sure that the roads would be safe and that the water from our neighborhood would be okay. We never thought our letter or our names would be used to try to stop the processing of the project. We actually support the project and are angry that that we have been used by the Keep It Rural for their personal agenda. We did not ask to be represented by the Keep It Rural attorney, and we never gave them any money. We did not want the county to think that we are part of this group. We think someone at the county should look into the other names on the list and make sure that our neighbors weren't lied about. I would also like to add, which is not in the letter, that I think the Board of Supervisors and the people of Calaveras County have heard too much negative propaganda about the Trinitros project. It would be nice to hear and read about all the positive things that the project would bring to the county and the community. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And any other members of the public or staff wish to address the board?
Good morning, Chair, members of the board, Mary Mutz, Agricultural Commissioner. I would like to present you with the 2007 Calaveras County Report of Agriculture. Overall, the agricultural production was 20% lower in 2007 as compared to 2006. This represents a $5 million decrease, largely due to a reduction of $4 million from the timber industry. Timber harvest was down due to the downturn in the housing industry. The cattle inventory was also a bit down from prior year, which also contributed to the reduction in production. However, the walnut industry saw an increase in value due to the short supply of walnuts, therefore the price was higher. So I have copies for each of you, our CAO, and members of the press. The report will be posted online at the Department of Agriculture's website.
Thank you, Mary.
Thank you.
Good morning. Brian Moss, Environmental Management. Just wanted to share with the board, you already may be aware that one of our senior staff members, Tony Maris, is going to be heading to Amador County. He's going to be leaving us. His last day is Thursday. And if the board would like, anybody from the board would like to join us between 2 and 4, we'll be having a reception for him at our offices.
That's today?
That would be Thursday.
Thursday, okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Would any other member of the public like to address the board today on a matter not on the agenda? Okay. Hearing none, we'll move to item 11, a discussion and possible action regarding a minute order authorizing the board chair to sign an annual work plan and financial plan agreement.
Good morning once again, Mary Mutz, Commissioner. 2 weeks ago, we had a lengthy conversation regarding the agreement with Wildlife Services, USDA, and the county. And today, I'm asking for approval of a minute order authorizing the chair to sign the annual work plan financial agreement between the county and the USDA Wildlife Services for $78,000 for 1.5 full-time employees.
You said 1.5.
I said 1.5 full-time employees.
And I believe that restores.
Mr. Chair, I'll move the minute order then.
I'll second it.
As presented.
All right, there's a motion to second. Any discussion? Those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Passes on a 4-0-1. Thank you very much. Congratulations, everybody. Glad it worked out. Okay, we will now move to item number 12, discussion and possible action regarding the introduction and first reading of an ordinance approving revisions to Chapter 15.06 flood damage prevention. Mr. Selman.
Mr. Chairman, today's object is a introduction and first reading of this ordinance. This is substantially a updating of our current ordinance. It has been languishing for quite some time, and we had some visits from the floodplain administration folks that suggested we really needed to kind of review ours against their requirements and make sure that we have conformed the two of them. So you have before you a draft. Actually, when we worked our way all the way through this draft ordinance, there are not that many changes compared to the way the county actually has adopted and administered its codes throughout the years. What we are substantially doing is addressing some of it is the documentation that needs to be done annually or as projects move through the process. Some of it is a formalization of the county's practices. Some of it is adopting clarifying language so people can understand. And we've tried to take some of the legalese and move it around in such a way without changing its intent or the content of the language to make it a little bit easier to read and understand, which is not all that easy in some cases. So if we haven't succeeded, there are limits. The staff report presented to you identifies a number of things. The biggest conceptual change that I think people, if they were to compare this ordinance against the current ordinance, is the fact that we have set the freeboard requirement for residential dwelling units at 2 feet above the flood elevation. But in fact, that's the current county application. That's what we do right now. So if we have a 100-year flood elevation, when that elevation is determined, although our ordinance allows us to set it at that elevation, the custom and practice, and I understand it has been that for years, is to place that first floor elevation 2 feet above that mark. And that does two things. It provides, obviously, the opportunity for error in case that flood is, instead of being, for the sake of argument, 100 feet, 100.5 feet, it gives you some of that. The second thing is it recognizes that floods are not orderly events that occur across tabletops like our maps do. And when you have things like wind or debris or other things that move downstreams, you need a little bit of a buffer to secure and safeguard those properties that may be in harm's way and hopefully limit direct damage. So that's probably the thing that may appear as the most controversial, but in fact really is no change over the current practices. We have some issues. We noted in the staff report we have a certification process for the Gold Creek levee. Actually, the levee is a levee no longer. The levee was originally proposed, and we found there was a lot of documentation work on how to validate this levee, and in fact the levee was subsequently backfilled, so we have a different process we have to go through in order to get that certification. With that certification, a number of the lots that are currently designated as being in a federal floodplain, and right now we would advise people they need to have flood insurance, will come out of that designation. So once we get the document completed and FEMA accepts it, then those designations will go away, and hopefully that added burden of having to acquire insurance would also go away. There are some record-keeping procedures that the county needs to clean up and make sure we're keeping track of. We've addressed that. There's a biennial report that was omitted, and a report on the latest flood event with the county filed coordinated with the Office of Emergency Services. So we're formalizing how those types of procedures are taken care of and making sure that we're in compliance with the federal regulations. We have also, and this is one of the things, if you compare the ordinance, will look like a lot of change. We've tried to reorder our ordinance in such a way that it more closely conforms to the order and language in the federal rules, so that if you look at them, you can directly compare as opposed to having to search for where the county put its language in a different location or under different headings. So again, these are all intended to simplify and make the document more usable and readable. I think those are the primary ones. Again, the primary beneficiaries, if we do these ordinances right, are the very clients that we serve that have no choice but to some degree develop in a floodplain. Our first and most obvious goal is to not have development in floodplains that cause problems. But if you have to, we need to do it in such a way that causes the least danger for the public in general, who may have to respond during floods, and the client who actually lives in that house. And we're trying to do that through design standards, which are clarified, and if we can follow these other protocols, we can get reductions in the premiums that people would actually have to pay for that flood insurance. So by doing our paperwork right, having our ordinances in shape, we can in fact reduce some of the actual costs to clients in the future as they have to go out and get flood insurance. One of the things that is happening, and this is almost as an aside, but this is also part of our driving force in this matter, is that the federal mapping is going digital. Okay, so there's not really a change in the federal mapping of the floodplains throughout the county yet. They're doing a number of different things, but one of them is they're going to reduce the county's floodplain system to something that fits on a CD or two. And these are circulated to all the agencies throughout the state and nation that deal with insurance, loans, and so on. So virtually every agency that has to deal with property in our county has all of the floodplain mapping information available. So it's in our interest, I think, that rather than create a problem for our constituents, we get our ordinance up to date and keep it there so that, you know, you may end up contracting with somebody in San Francisco or Chicago for a loan or something. Well, they're going to have the disc that shows all of our flood information anyway. So we're trying to make sure that all of our ordinances have placed the county in the best position possible for the lowest insurance rates and to safeguard the citizens. So I'm going to stop there. If you have questions, I'll try to answer them. And again, this is a first reading. There is nothing but an introduction. There is no final action taken. If you have further questions or something does come up, we can certainly address it further.
Yeah, I had one question on procedure. On the memo dated May 28th, 2008 from the CDA, we have a agenda title that calls this a public hearing, and on the agenda posted for this meeting, this is called a discussion and possible action without reference to a public hearing. Can you give me some advice as to which the agency wishes to?
I would certainly open a hearing if there's any question. Input from the public is always welcome. We're here to serve the public, so if there's anyone who wanted to add anything, I would certainly not discourage that.
All right. Even though it's not listed on the public agenda?
Correct. I thought it was listed actually in a public hearing.
County Council, is that acceptable to open a public hearing on this matter?
Oh, yeah, it's not.
You can just take public input. You
It's
don't
not
have
one
to
of
have a
those
public
items
hearing.
formal.
I'm asking whether this is a formal public hearing or whether we're
It's not
simply
one of
taking...
those items where a formal public hearing is required. I think that language was gratuitous, but certainly public input is always appropriate.
All right. Well, as usual, we will certainly make room for that.
Okay.
Any questions from the board?
Yes.
Bill?
Well, if I understand correctly, FEMA, at least FEMA, and perhaps one or more other agencies are in the process of remapping because their maps are 20 years in arrears, and they don't seem to be accurate according to some.
Actually, they are not remapping. They are converting the current system to a GIS digitized system, but they are not actually recalculating what those flood elevations are at this time. I don't believe, Dave, there were any specific, there are no specific study areas that are required or proposed at this time in a countywide basis.
Just
around Tulloch. Okay, Tulloch, we have one where we have actually introduced it because we have a problem because we have a 515 flood lake, and there is obviously a problem with their mapping there because they don't recognize it. So we've started that process formally.
2 years ago in April, when we had the flood down on Cosgrove Creek, and as it goes out of the county all through that area of Youngs Creek and Cosgrove Creek, there was concern that some of the inundated areas were not actually in the designated flood, 100-year flood zone. So have they rectified that? Is that,
I don't believe they've rectified that yet. That obviously is one of our primary areas of concern. It's probably one of the larger areas that really is subject to classic flooding as we see it. We have some other flood areas, but they're relatively small. That's one that through time we absolutely need to get rectified, and we're all in agreement on that.
So when this is digitized, it'll just be that much more available to builders, developers, and homeowners, and the insurance industry to do their calculations.
And we have made clear that as land develops, there is language here that makes it clear that, as an example, subdivisions over 50 units are required to do the engineering studies that support those floodplain numbers if they aren't existing. So there's some other implementation procedures that will address some of that.
So is this also a tool that can be at least referred to when you have developments that are of a certain size or may present some impact for runoff? They're not actually in the designated flood zone, but maybe adjacent to or in what might be referred to as the watershed from that there's some attention given to the impervious surfaces that will add to the flow in that flood zone and sort of incorporate any impact that might come from those.
There is that, plus we are dealing with that through the stormwater drainage ordinances. We have been very careful in all of our recent develops to make sure that we are providing for detention of water so that although we will have, if you increase permeability, you cannot decrease the amount of water that flows off. What we try to do is detain it so that we have a no net rise in flood elevations. Even though it would run slightly longer, it would be no greater direct threat to
So they need to address adequate detention so that the average flow doesn't exceed
whatever the current background is.
Okay. The only other thing I see in here that I have a question about, or at least a comment about, is it's on page 7, and it's under obstructions. It's actually in definitions, obstructions that are not allowed. And it goes on to, it's on page 7 of 20, it goes on to ask or to state that these obstructions can be excavation, channelization, in other words, man-made obstructions. Mm-hmm. And in light of the comments made earlier about this cleaning out of Cosgrove Creek, which kind of smacks of the same difficulties we've had with Gillum Road, it goes on to say, what does it say? Gravel, refuse, fill, vegetation, or other material that will obviously restrict the flow and so on and so forth. And so this ordinance, does this in any way help us work with the various agencies that sometimes obstruct our efforts to keep the existing channel free? I mean, see that they don't want the obstructions, but are we going to be able to deal with that in any different way by virtue of this or not?
I think not because of this ordinance. I mean, in California, we actually have recognized on a statewide basis that there is a huge discrepancy between the way California wants to protect its, as an example, its levees because of their riparian values versus what perhaps the Corps of Engineers might want, nice clean banks with no growth and no vegetation. And the state of California itself is working on trying to resolve that as a statewide issue. So I think that's the real answer.
Okay, so according to this ordinance is simply going to direct that prohibition of obstructions to things that are created by homeowners, developers,
correct, et cetera. Right. We're looking at the very small scale rather than the larger scale at this level.
Okay. Other questions from the board?
Bob, I have a couple questions for you. You mentioned in your opening comments that those that have to build within floodplains. Frankly, I don't think anybody has to build within a floodplain. I think we have plenty of ground on which to build that's outside of a floodplain. So I'm concerned because I'm from your comments and a little bit taken from the ordinance, it sounds like what this ordinance is going to do is allow people to build within a floodplain as long as the floor is 2 feet above the base year flood, which is the 100-year flood. Is that correct?
Not quite. What the actual implementation of our ordinance has been is for construction purposes, if there is any area outside of the floodplain on a parcel, that is where we direct folks to build first and foremost. Okay, our object is to get people out of the floodplain. Unfortunately, the county has created some parcels that are entirely within a floodplain.
Okay.
And that is a problem. We have to try to accommodate those individuals so that if it is possible, we can hold them whole while not adversely affecting the public. The other thing is not every floodplain, and you have to remember, not every floodplain is subject to the seriousness of the impact of a direct floodway, which is typically the heavy flowing waters. Some of our areas are really backup areas. They're areas where water moves around into shallow areas and pools. So a floodplain might have an elevation that, for the sake of argument, might be standing water that's 6 or 8 or a foot deep, but that's all it is. It rises like the tide and it recedes like the tide. So you get a lot of water there. It's not subject to heavy erosion. You don't have a lot of buildup of debris, but it's there and it's going to cause you a problem if you're sitting in it. So again, if we look at those areas and try to keep them out, first of all, we keep people entirely out of the floodway. If it's a floodway, that's a different designation entirely. We're talking substantially the backup areas that aren't subject to significant hydrologic pressures. But if it's the only area on the ground and the county created the situation through its processes of allowing parcels to be created, we think we have an obligation to see if there's a safe answer that causes the least harm to the property owner and absolutely no harm to other downstream users of that area at all. So it's a tough balancing act.
Let me give you my comment because I strongly disagree with a couple of your assumptions. Number one is I don't believe, unless the county were the applicant, that the county created the parcel.
Okay.
I think the applicant created the parcel, but the county accommodated the request of the applicant. I don't believe it's the obligation of the county to make every legally created parcel buildable. That's the obligation of the parcel owner to come up and make sure that, in my opinion, he has legal access, he has proper driveway slopes, he has water, he has sewer, he meets the setbacks, he meets all the conditions that we go into that should, in my opinion, be a requirement for pulling a building permit. I am not at all interested in an ordinance that's going to accommodate building in the floodplain. I think we're just backing ourselves into a horrible hole if we do that. And if we have parcels that are 100% within the floodplain, then as far as I'm concerned, they're not buildable. It's no different than basically, not being able to have a septic that works out at the end of bar 20. I mean, you don't have a septic, you're not going to get a building permit. If you have 100% of the parcels in the floodplain, then as far as I'm concerned, that's not a buildable parcel. And if this ordinance is going to accommodate that, then I am not going to be in favor of this ordinance, because I think we need to have a very black and white, cut and dried ordinance that basically says we are not going to accommodate building in a floodplain. And I think it's important when we do have these floods that we do have areas for the water to go. Sure. And either that or we're going to build a dam or we're going to build levees. You've got to have some place for the water to go. And you can basically say, well, it's just 6 feet of water and the floor will be at 8 feet. But that's going to cause a tremendous amount of damage, and everybody will be in here just like Cosgrove Creek, demanding that the county do something about it. And the county not only created the parcel, my God, the county issued a building permit, so the county's now responsible, in their opinion, for the house. And I don't want to go there. I just don't want to go there at all. And there's no reason, in my opinion, we have plenty of land in the county upon which to build, and I don't see any reason to start building in floodplains. And what you're telling me is this ordinance allows people to build in floodplains at the discretion of the county, whatever that means, as long as the floor is 2 feet above the high water mark. Is that what you're telling me?
Substantially, that's correct. Yeah, I mean, there's lots of other,
I have a couple other
things that
questions,
have to be
but
done.
I will not
yes.
be voting in favor of this ordinance if this is what the ordinance does.
And let me, in response, Mr. Chairman, yours is the, I don't want to say absolute legal right, but you certainly have the right to write your ordinance any way that you want to that is not in violation of the federal rules. So you can certainly, in this case, be more stringent. We have tried to place this ordinance consistent with custom and practice throughout the state. So you don't have to. If you wanted to have it different or prohibit it entirely, that's your call. I think we should talk about that further before we go quite that far, because I think council is going to want to have a chat about some of the implications of that. But you certainly have the right to be more stringent than the federal requirements. And this is, it is technically slightly more stringent, but it is not as stringent as Supervisor Tryon is suggesting.
All right, I'd certainly on this topic, if you'd like to finish, we can do that, but I'd be interested to see where the board is on that. It's pretty fundamental to what's before us.
It's pretty fundamental to what's before us, in my opinion.
So on this particular subject, Supervisor Tryon brought up, what are the opinions of the other board members?
I certainly am not in favor of allowing people to head down the path to build their houses where it's a foregone conclusion that in a flood event they're going to flood. However, we all travel the highways and byways of California, and if you can visualize the area between, say, Manteca and Tracy, that whole area out there is subject to flooding every 5 or 10 years. And we've seen in the last 20 years or so this phenomenon that people start moving huge amounts of dirt out into an area. They build up a platform that's 12 feet high out above the mean plane of the surrounding area, and they build a wonderful looking house on top of it. I don't think that this body has any business trying to legislate people's ability away from using their lands, as long as they're, if they've got a piece of property, they want to build a house on it, it's in a floodplain, as long as they raise the house up to a point where it's not going to be affected by the flood in exactly the same way that those property owners do in the area between Manteca and Tracy. I have no problem with allowing that to happen. I think that we should be careful to identify those areas, and with Mr. Pestizo's skills with the GIS and stuff, I think that we can flag those. Anybody coming in with a building permit or requesting a building permit to build a house in an area where it's likely to flood, I mean, we could just simply say, okay, be mindful of the fact that you've got to put your house up on stilts or on a berm or on some elevated soil. And I just hope to God that these floodplains don't have anything to do with Gillum Road. It could postpone our work out there for another couple of decades.
They do have something to do with Cosgrove Creek.
Yeah.
Cosgrove Creek is...
We're paying, the citizens are paying lots and lots of money to try to address that.
And the representative from the aforementioned creek.
The aforementioned creek. You know, Tom, you make some valid points in this, and tax dollars are going to take care of that creek. The biggest problem with the creek is we're not allowed to maintain the channel. That's the biggest problem with the creek. And the water there does have a place to go. It has a channel, Cosgrove Creek, the convergence of Young and Cosgrove Creek, and then continuing west down Cosgrove Creek, and that's where the problem is. I am not in favor of telling people they cannot build on their property, provided that we have an ordinance that takes care of the 100-year flood threat. You know, I don't want the people to get the idea that we're going to permit building in the middle of the Cosgrove Creek. There are setbacks for habitat there. And so these places that are in the floodplain are not necessarily on the banks of the creek. They are places, as Mr. Sullivan described, there are places that are perhaps low in elevation where the bank does not raise rapidly, and in events of 100-year floods, the water does encroach out there, but it is still water. I think that if somebody purchases the land, there should be disclosure. And of course, when a building permit is applied for, there is not only disclosure, but there is an ordinance, if it's this ordinance or some other ordinance, that tells them where the water could potentially rise to, and that they are required to build above that. And it is not unusual throughout the state of California. It's not unusual throughout the country. These floods are going on. The news this morning said biblical proportions back in Iowa and around. You can't predict that. So you could expand this out to large areas of the county where there are developments. The potential is always there for a flood. But if people know where the best minds have said that it is a potential flood zone, not that it's going to flood there, but it's in that zone, and the water could rise 6 inches or a foot, and you must have your home at a minimum of 2 feet above the high flood level. It goes to me back to a person's right to do that on their property, provided they are advised of the potential threat and they comply with the building criteria that's going to elevate them out of that threat. The big thing about this is, one of the big things about this is, if they do this, if we have our ordinance, and if the builders and potential homeowners comply with this, is going to provide these people with adequate insurance, which is not the case now. So we have a big improvement there. It gives them a better shot at affording flood insurance. Correct. So I have faith that the building department here and the licensed contractors are going to address this flood zone issue in their building. And I'm in full support of this.
Guess I'll call on myself for this as well. This ordinance has been described as essentially putting its imprimatur on existing practice, not altering much from our past, but modernizing the language that justifies it. I'm not super impressed with the way we've handled build-out in floodplains in this county. I think we've had, the price tag, for instance, on the fix on Cosgrove to protect the homes that have already been built in the floodplain looks to be in the neighborhood of $5 million for taxpayer money, some of which comes out of our own, if we were to do this, comes out of our own pocket here. And as you know, our situation at the moment, the budget that's before us in the next couple of weeks is a little short. So the question is, do we want to dig this hole any deeper? Do we want to have more things to protect and fix in places that we know are likely to experience some form of flooding? There are all kinds of potential. We could build on stilts. We could sink large cement footings, and that way they won't wash away. But I'm not so sure that it's good policy in general to build in floodplains. I think we're finding places all over the world that are learning about that. And why would we play our own role in making things worse? I don't think that this necessarily should be barring all things, but I think it should be much more stringent than anything that we have done in the past. It's just too much evidence in now that we haven't thought this through well enough to avoid massive expense and deep harm to people who have sometimes unwittingly bought it. I don't want to mention where our CAO bought his house, but he's perilously close to.
I didn't buy it; it was sold to me.
Solano folks would never know what they were coming into if they bought during summer. But at any rate, I think it's important that we weigh in as a board and try to give the staff a little bit more instruction on this. I share Tom's concerns, and I think that we would need to hear from our fifth supervisor to get a sense of whether where a majority lay. I would hope that we'd reach some consensus, that we could find a way to reconcile some differences, and maybe there's some nuanced details that might better inform this. My suggestion would be, given the comments, that you not proceed in the existing direction until there's a clarity as to what the wishes of the board majority would be. Can you provide some options that reflect some of the concerns so that we might bring it back for further review upon Supervisor Callaway's return?
May I suggest to you a couple of things? Number one, we have heard your comments loud and clear about not developing in the floodplain. I mean, that's our first and foremost goal, is to keep people out. So if there is an option of avoidance, that the director has made it abundantly clear to everybody, stay out of those areas. First and foremost.
Well, you mean if there, this was what worries me. You say if there is an option. There is an option. We don't build residential homes in the floodplain.
Okay, that's a level of choice, if you would.
It's a policy.
That's a policy decision. So I mean, we haven't gone that far that we have heard yet, and you may choose to do so. That technically is slightly separate from the question of, if there is development in a floodplain of any nature, what needs to be done in order to make sure it's done in such a way that it does not increase flooding hazard, whether it's vegetation or landscaping or building accessory buildings and so on. I mean, we probably still need some rules, unless the board wants to just say, absolutely, unequivocally, there shall be no building within any designated floodplain, then we don't need the ordinance. Okay, if we do something short of that, we still need the ordinance, and we can certainly make it as stringent as your board wants. That's not a problem. Okay, and just a few places, changes could be introduced into this code which would solve your problem entirely, as far as where, how high, and those types of things. So we still need the ordinance, I believe, as long as the potential exists for any sort of construction within the flood designated areas, so we stay consistent with the federal laws. But certainly your board has the absolute right to regulate far more stringently than we have to date.
And so what I was suggesting earlier is that somewhere between the existing practice with this imprimatur put on it and the idea that there would be nothing whatsoever, there are a number of different options, I believe, which have been, if you look at Napa, for instance, there's been quite a bit of development along the Napa River and a lot of work on trying to figure this out. I think there are several other counties that have created ordinances that we might want to review and see whether there's some third door that can open here that might win a board majority. And again, we can't even know what that would look like without the fifth supervisor in the room. But is it possible that we might take a look at some of those and see what options are there for us?
Absolutely. I would ask, and I do this somewhat procedurally because we do have the federal government looking at us, that you at least introduce this ordinance and take no further action. Okay, I'm not suggesting you do anything, but we need to report that we are making progress towards these issues, and what you're talking about is something far greater than they would require of us in any time or any manner. But this would at least keep us on track for those items that we do have to deal with them. So I'm not asking for any final action on it, obviously.
Well, before we take any action, I'd like to open up for public comment. If there
May I finish?
Oh, certainly. I'm sorry, Tom.
A couple of comments just off of yours, Bob.
Sure.
I'm interested in your option that does not have an ordinance and basically just says we do not build in the floodplain, at least as far as residential is concerned. I don't mind somebody putting a barn down there to store hay in, or if you want a construction yard or the like. But I don't think there should be any residential construction whatsoever within the floodplain. And the simple reality is when we have significant flood events, we tend to lose roads. Usually we lose Highway 4, at least the old section between Angels and Copper. You have a lot of debris comes down. You get temporary dams that build up and then break. You have trees and logs and everything coming through. To me, you tend to lose power, and power lines go down, and usually it's in a huge storm. And the idea that we're just going to, take all our emergency services and worry about people that are built in floodplains, to me makes no sense whatsoever. And when there's damage, they will immediately run, just like the Cosgrove Creek people did. When that first happened, I said, well, you should form a benefit basin down there, and the people within Cosgrove Creek flood basin should self-assess and fix the problem, because I think there should be some self-responsibility here, and of course that was just laughed out by the board, and by God, you couldn't communalize it and dump it on the taxpayers fast enough, and now we're talking millions, and to go there just makes no sense at all. So that completes my comments on that. Let me complete my questions then on the comments anyway on the ordinance as presented. In here we talk about a floodplain administrator, like somebody is going to be in charge of the floodplain. Who is the floodplain administrator anticipated to be?
The immediate person would be the director of the Community Development Agency, and then, like everything else, that assignment would be assigned to staff to actually deal with. Okay. Absolutely.
That's what I thought the answer would be.
Yeah, he may be sitting in the back corner of the room at the moment.
Okay. Then let me go to page 9 of 20, and then page 11 of 20. And this is an issue I always raise every time we've had issues on flooding, and that is everybody seems to want to. Page 9 of 20 basically says, identified by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA. And, FEMA has truly gotten it wrong in this county on many occasions when it comes to flood plains and flood events. And if they're going to update their maps, that's wonderful. But I think, when people come in and do projects, I think we need to do a physical inspection, and we need to see if we need something further. And something further I think you're trying to address on page 11, where it says under C there, 5C or something, anyway. It says review, use, and development of other base flood data shall obtain, review, and reasonably utilize any base flood elevation, which is a 100-year flood, and floodway data available from a federal, state agency, or other source. So I'm assuming what you're saying here then is that we're not just going to use the FEMA map. We're going to go out on a project and look, and we're going to use other sources. And if we even think that no source has addressed this, but there may be a flood problem, then we're going to require a study to determine if this is within a 100-year floodplain. Is that correct?
That is, in fact, the practice. I mean,
okay.
we have. I mean, actually, the state of California has its own mapping program of other streams and so on that may have flooding issues. But we try always to use FEMA as the first defense as to whether or not there's an issue. But after that, we look at the ground, and if it's questionable or there's something that's obviously a problem,
because
we're going to have that addressed.
It seems to me we have buildings, and I can name a couple in my district that sure look to me like they're within a floodplain.
Yeah, I hear you.
Like everybody else are within a floodplain, and they're right next to the creek, and they're on septic, and it's like, what the heck are we doing? And I don't understand what the review process was that permitted them, quite frankly. And but that completes my comments, and I guess I am just, for myself, I'm not going to vote for an ordinance that allows residential construction within floodplains. I think that's just asking for it, and it will continue to get asked for it, and it will always come back on the taxpayer, whether it's the local taxpayer or the state taxpayer or the federal taxpayer. Will bail out every one of these problems, just like all problems seem to get communalized, and self-responsibility doesn't seem to be something other than a word, 2 words anymore. Completes my comments.
I'd like to follow up on one question related to issue Tom raised. I have also been unimpressed with FEMA's maps, and especially in as much as we've seen flooding in places that they consider to be a 500-year or 100-year floodplain maybe 3 or 4 times in the last 10 years. So I figure maybe something's a little off on the science. Do we keep any kind of track of places that actually have flooded in this county, and do we have a local database that can be instructive to that?
That should have been done in coordination with the Office of Emergency Services locally, as well as the building department, because of, as we do assessments for damage, we should be keeping track of all of those numbers. So I can't tell you personally where it is, and that's one of the things we do want to clean up, is that we get that registry. We're working towards getting all of the parcels that have floodplain designation into the GIS. They're there already, but identifying them individually so that we can deal with them through our Permits Plus system. Clearly, there are areas that are outside of designated floodplains that flood, and we know that. So as we build those databases, that's the kind of work that we're going to have to continue to do in order to safeguard the public and get that information available.
I don't know whether that's administrative in nature or statutory, but I'm sure it would reassure me a little bit if we could say that we were actually doing that, keeping track, and that would be one of the measures that we would use in looking at this stuff. And page 11 might be the place for upgrading that.
Okay.
All right. Are there members of the public that wish to speak to this item?
I have something else.
Oh, I'm sorry. Excuse me. Supervisor Claudino has indicated he has further comment, and then we'll move to public.
Okay. Your comments, Steve, and yours too, Tom, obviously have merit, but, you know, Cosgrove Creek is the focus of attention right now because of the recent events there 2 years ago. But those homes that were damaged there were all permitted without this ordinance, and the ones that were flooded down there would not be permitted with this ordinance. So substantially,
a lot of those homes were prior to our administration
of this
program.
I was down there, and believe me, those homes, anybody could see that they were at or below high water marks for the Cosgrove Creek itself, let alone flood levels. And so over the past 15 or 20 years, maybe 25 years, those have been allowed to be built. They should not have, but they are, and they're still there today. There have been suggestions that those folks might want to retrofit their homes by raising them above that level. Had they done that, they wouldn't have the flood damage that they do have. But that aside, it seems to me it's going to be very difficult for this county to say, well, so-and-so wants to build a home here. It's outside any designated flood zone, but we're going to send someone out there who has no training or expertise and say, I think it's going to flood there. And that's maybe an exaggeration, but that's sort of what this conversation is saying. That's going to be a pretty slippery slope. So there's going to have to be some expert involvement in that. If I were a homeowner and I was not, a property owner, I own a piece of property in an area that's not designated as a flood zone, and the county came out and said, well, you can't build there because it could flood there someday. I don't think I want to get involved in that. If this comes back with some other, if it does come back in some other form, I don't know how difficult this would be, Mr. Selman, but the Cosgrove and Youngs Creek is the one designated flood zone. Some of the zone that's designated as flood zone down there was not inundated. Conversely, some that was inundated. So obviously, as Steve said, there's some problem with the science here. But they can't be the only flood zone in Calaveras County. And so what I would like to see is at least where the designated flood zones are in this county, and also what sort of development is there, and an idea of how many designated lots, whether they were created by the county or the developer or the homeowner or the builder or whoever. I'd like to see where we are with this whole issue, because it's not a Cosgrove Creek issue. This is a county-wide issue.
Correct.
And so if we're going to massage this any further, I think more data would help. And so I would like to see that.
I know our GIS guy, yep, he's still here. I know he can develop a map that would show both developed and undeveloped parcels within existing floodplains, and I would hope we might add to that places that have flooded over the last, say, 10, 20 years.
we can certainly work towards all of that. And clearly where we have the data, that's fine. Through my years having dealt with floodplains, let me tell you that, I mean, I'd probably like to bring the folks from FEMA and have a talk with you at some point if you're so interested. But let me suggest to you, the 1% flood, which is that's that 1 year out of 100. It's like every other statistical thing. It is a roll of the dice, and the odds are the same each and every year. I have seen areas that were subject to the infamous 100-year flood virtually every 10 years. I have seen areas that were along the same stretch of a river where, because of local winds, storm cells, one area that is in a floodplain would be higher than normal and the other 50 yards, 100 yards downstream, apparently untouched. Mother Nature does terrible things to us when we think we've got it mapped exactly. So we have to assume that we don't have it exactly. That's why we always talk about some freeboard. I'd be happy to do that further, and if you wish, we'd be pleased, and I'm sure the federal government would get an agent up here in no time at all to talk to you about some of these issues. And clearly, if you do more, it solves the problem.
Just one more comment.
Okay, Bill.
One more comment. I just want to say that I'm very much in agreement with the policy not to allow further development in flood zones. It's not a good idea, obviously. Absolutely. But not to be crying about the sky falling here either, but I'm looking at the homeowner, the property owner, who purchased a lot, or owns a lot that is, say, worth $200,000, $250,000. And now we've decided that there will be no building on that lot. And I think you see the implications of that. I'm not sure how the county's going to deal with that county-wide. You have now told this person that the lot is virtually useless unless they want to plant rice on it or something of that nature. And what that's going to do to the value of that lot. And there's going to be a lot of difficulty in dealing with that. So I would prefer these people be advised of the conditions that are potential for that property, be it the science or the technology or the building code that allows them to mitigate that particular danger and build their home there, get insurance for it, and allow them to participate in the use of their property. Okay, I think I'm done.
Thank you. We'll now move it to input from the public.
Joe Kelly. This is an insufficient document. It fails to address all issues. GIS mapping needs to be prepared as a comprehensive inclusion to this document and relative to other documents or relate to other documents. Identify all floodplains. How does this ordinance conform with other county ordinances such as the Stormwater Management Plan, Regional Waters Rules, existing general plan, and zoning maps? What was just said by Supervisor Claudino and addressed by Supervisor Tryon. What is the county's responsibility for its involvement through permitting raised roads and its failure to recognize illegal dams? There's another key for your flooding problems that has been ignored for over 30 years in this county. When the agency FEMA is used, it should be explained that FEMA's considerations are of risk assessment, as stated on FEMA's website. Again, on your finding of facts, 150612B, I would say that your illegal dams, county-approved raised roads, acting as secondary dams should be addressed in this particular area. Section E of 1506.014, prevent and regulate construction of flood barriers which will unnaturally divert floodwaters. There you go again. There's your raised roads or any other kind of thing that might be done through a permitted process because something isn't seen. the concept on page 5 of 21, under functionally dependent use, means a use which cannot perform its intended purpose unless it's located or carried out in close proximity to water. The term only includes only docking facilities. That should be changed. That should take into account anything that is affected by loss of use caused by flooding. On page 6 of 21, at the bottom, it talks about the cost of replacement structure shall be based on square foot cost factor, determined reference building, and recognized by the building construction industry. No, or as an additive, it should also be the Board of Equalization statutes. I think they might have a little bit wider, broader offering in values in that respect. On page 7 of 21, obstruction. There we go, but it's not limited to any dam. There's where this county needs to, again, research and look for these illegal dams that are in this county. And now I do believe that under your stormwater management plan, this county has the ability to go ahead and force the issue of the removal of those dams without the necessity of the state. At least that's what I picked up when you did your stormwater management plan. If not, then call the state, the proper state agency in. On page 9 of 21, 150632, basis for establishing the areas of flood zone, special flood hazard. Once again, identifying FEMA and the 1990 report. That 1990 report, they came out in 1988 and did this study in this county. Then they did their report in 1990. The key thing missing out of this is, in that report it says no flooding in Calaveras County. So they didn't even, yet there are maps, they show maps of areas of water. My property has that. That's one reason why I backed off of my process for a split of the property, because of that. But what it also shows is when you bring FEMA or any other agency in, unless they not only look at the cause, they look at what the problem is, they have to look at the cause. FEMA didn't do it, nor has anybody else. And we'll get into this issue. If this information is then, once this comes into full, a comprehensive document and a statement, then I hope it would be issued out to the title insurance companies to include GIS mappings and any other agency of that sort. So that when a homeowner comes in, oh, and by the way, that it is in the permitting process of this county. So when a person walks in, they can give you a APN number or an address or a road or whatever and be able to pop this up and show what's what, so that that person isn't subjected to, because of through escrow there's non-disclosure of a flood issue, and FEMA map says there isn't a flood issue, but in fact there is a flood issue. That's about it for me. I would like to see this thing go back out, come back, and since it's not just a first reading, that it actually goes back and a committee be formed to discuss this and go over this, as has been done with such as the road ordinance years ago that was never followed through on. But this thing is something that is a necessity, and I think that by possibly getting other people out in the communities that are having problems, and then they can bring it forward, then we start to get into a little more of a comprehensive document rather than just a business as usual document with a few minor changes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. Are there other members of the public who wish to address the board on this topic? Hearing none, we'll bring it back to the board. Is there any motion for direction on this?
Well, I think that we have, I think we've made ourselves clear as mud with Mr. Selman. Bob, would you come up here, please? I would like to, for myself, I would like to see you come back to this board with identification of the flood zones and those parcels created in those flood zones, those that are perhaps developed and not developed, to give us an idea of the scope of what we're talking about here?
Okay, we have had our floodplain mapping on our GIS for about 5 years, so that information is generally available as far as to which parcels are there. An exact number of the ones that are developed or are undeveloped is a little bit more problematic because we have to make an estimate of a value. So we can do it. It's an arithmetic calculation, but yes, we can do that. Again, they are approximations only. You have to accept that because we don't identify necessarily how something is developed, only that something is there. And to go through on literally a parcel by parcel basis to determine, what the nature of the construction is would be a pretty significant undertaking at this point. We can get you some general numbers.
Okay. I have no idea, to be honest with you, how many buildable parcels today exist within flood zones. So I don't have a grasp of
we'll get you numbers.
How many parcels that we would make worthless if we were to say absolutely no residential building, in a flood zone.
Okay. Now, the other issue, again, is what we give you would be the numbers of parcels that are within designated floodplains. It doesn't necessarily break out the distinction between a floodway, which is an area we would never allow development in, and the other. So, again, these are the little twists and turns we have to deal with.
Right. And it goes back to what my understanding is, that the floodway, you do not allow construction in a floodway today.
That's correct.
This is simply the floodplain.
Floodplain.
Okay.
Might I raise the thought that we would be asking for both the further information on this, as Bill just described, and further options that might be anywhere from more stringent restrictions on building in floodplains or requirements for mitigation to the option that Supervisor Tryon raised, so that our next discussion can have that full range of choice and the information necessary to make it.
Okay, I would certainly be happy to do that. This sounds, I suppose, a little contrary to that request, and I don't mean it in that tone, but I would ask that you, in fact, introduce this ordinance. We do have a floodplain program already in place. I want to make sure we don't do anything that may be considered as jeopardizing that, since what you're talking about is added restrictions, not lesser ones. So I would ask if you could introduce the ordinance and continue it. We can continue again, and if we need to reintroduce, that would be fine. I would just not like the federal government to think for any reason that we're not serious about regulating regulating under their requirements.
In as much as the range of options are rather significantly different from one another, would bringing this ordinance in require us, if we were to take another path, a complete rewrite and reintroduction, or would we
it may
be able to amend? I'd be interested in your thoughts, County Council.
Well, there's no downside in introducing it. It certainly wouldn't be binding. It would just avoid that step, at least until the composition of this board changes. The conversation I'm hearing is suggesting a significant amendment, and probably would require that the process start over again. But again, I say there's no downside in introducing it.
All right, and you'll let us know when we trigger, when whatever we're considering triggers the need to reintroduce.
I would, yes, definitely.
All right. Sure. Well, hearing that, is there a motion?
I'll move to introduce.
Second.
There's a motion and a second. Those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? There are 2 favorable, 2 not voting.
Aye. It's introduced.
All right, there you go. It's introduced.
But I hope it never gets adopted.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, normally you would ask that this be brought back at your next regular meeting. I would ask that we put this off at least for, let's go at least 3 weeks, or 3 meetings, whatever that turns out to, so we can be able to report back to you in a timely fashion and not lose track of it.
I think that would be very helpful.
Okay. So whatever that turns
Tell
to.
the federal government we're doing something.
I just want them to keep the insurance in place. That's the big
Everybody
thing.
okay with 3 weeks?
Fine.
All right, 3 weeks it is.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Sullivan.
We're almost on time.
We now move to our 10:30 presentation from the Treasurer Tax Collector.
Good morning. Pardon me, I'm suffering from a cold, so bear with me here. I'm sure you can hear me, though, even despite my cold. What we're doing is what we generally do every year, and do a discharge of accountability on certain accounts that we've determined that the people are dead. We cannot collect, you know what the old saying is about death and taxes. Well, you know, you can't get away with it unless you are dead. And we have a few on this list. They each have had liens filed on each of these accounts that are good for 10 years. And those that are larger than, say, $150 thereabouts will be renewed every 10 years. If there are still entities that we believe we might have an opportunity to collect on. And we do collect even after there is a discharge of accountability done. So I ask that, for your approval of the resolution for the discharge of accountability. Any questions that you'd like to ask?
Questions from the board?
So moved, Mr. Chair.
There's a motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Second.
Motion and a second. Any discussion? Those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Passes on a 4-0, 1 absent.
Thank you. I'll just stay here since I'm the next
yes,
one, too.
You're up next as well. And as I understand it, this item was originally proposed by Supervisor Callaway, who advised us by email that she hopes we will consider it carefully today.
Oh, yes, right. Right. The second item has to do with the annual approval of the investment policy, investment policy for the year 2008-2009. You each have a copy of it. There was one minor clarification issue on page, I think it's page 5, possibly. Let's see, where is it? Bear with me. No, it's page 8. And it has to do with mitigating credit risk in the portfolio. The policy has, and government code has stated, no more than 5% of the total portfolio may be invested in securities of any single issuer. There was something that came up last year that for 5 days we ended up having more than 5% in the portfolio on something. But we decided to clarify it, the investment advisors and the oversight committee, to add the term at the time of purchase. So long as we're good on the time of purchase, you can never stay right within that 5% on something that's moving all the time like the portfolio is for the county. So with your permission, we will approve this for the new year as well.
I'll move the item, Mr. Chair.
Second.
There's a motion and a second. Any discussion? Those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? 4-0 with 1 absent.
Thank you.
We now move to review of correspondence, reports, and various matters of concern. Let's start with Supervisor Thomas.
We may have to take a 20-minute break here. Actually, I don't have my calendar, sorry.
So want to wing it, or would you like to skip for a moment?
Well, I just want to put in a plug for the Arts Council. I'll be attending the first Music in the Park Wednesday, tomorrow night, Copperopolis Town Square. Come one, come all. Bring your lawn chairs.
You're buying refreshments?
I will guide you to the refreshment stand, yeah. But I won't pay. And also, there is a meeting tomorrow afternoon, 1:30. The Joint Water Committee, Bob Dean and I are holding forth at the Office of CCWD Board Chambers, beginning at 1:30, to continue to talk about the shared responsibility and the manner in which we will be including, or if we will be including, full-blown water element in the general plan. So if you're interested in coming to discuss that, please do. That concludes my comments for this week.
Thank you. Bill?
See, last week on Wednesday, I attended the Mountain Valley Emergency Medical Services board meeting in Copperopolis. And if you recall, the Ebbets Pass Fire came to this board for approval for their rate increase to the insurance companies to bring it up to the level that the American Legion and others are charging to the insurance companies, not to the customer or to the taxpayer. I should have mentioned that. So the process was that they had to come before this board initially because the rate increase was tantamount to more money than the Medicare allowances. This board passed that. They were at that meeting, and that board also passed it. So just as a closure to that, now the Ebbets Pass Fire Protection District has increased their fees for procedures, not for transportation, but for procedures and supplies that now is the same as the American Legion. Also, let's see, we went to the CMCAA. I'll let you talk about that if there's anything to talk about. Next, let's see, tomorrow there's this joint water meeting that Russ had just mentioned. Also, there's the Calaveras Amador McCollum River Authority, one of the many McCollum River authorities that meets at CCWD at 10 o'clock in the morning. That is the only other board-appointed responsibilities this week.
Thank you. Tom?
A couple items. Number one, I'll be leaving early tomorrow morning, so I won't be at the water forum. For RCRC, we're meeting in Crescent City, and so I'll be up there, probably returning either late Friday night or Saturday. But all is well. My son Walter is home for 1 week on summer break, and he said to let the board know that if there's a flood in the next 4 days, to call him. He'll be able to speak on my behalf as to whether there should be residential building in floodplains. The last item I have is apparently there's been a change in procedures in the Community Development Agency when it comes to pulling permits. And I've had a call from two constituents, one who I believe his house was built in 1972 and it's been sold several times, and he went in to pull a permit to do a deck and was told that his house was not finalized and that he had to pay for a final inspection and those fees concurrent with getting a final sign-off. Another individual called me and who had just the party had sold the house. The husband had died. They're very elderly. The lady has moved into the assisted living facility in Angels. They sold the house. And the new buyer went in to pull a permit to remodel, and I think this house was built in the early 80s. And there was an accessory dwelling above the garage, and the community agency basically said, well, we can't find, I'm not quite sure what they said, because there does seem to be a permit for the accessory dwelling, but they basically said if you want to remodel and get a permit for remodeling, you have to remove the accessory dwelling above the garage. So the new buyer said, well, okay, and so he basically destroyed the accessory dwelling and now is suing the lady that's in the assisted living facility for because when you do real estate, I guess one of the disclosures by the seller is whether permits have been granted for the building and the structures on the property, and they had signed and said, yes, permits have been granted because, to their knowledge, all the permits had been granted. And so now there's a lawsuit by the new owner against the lady in the assisted living facility. But what I'd like to do is have a study session with the community development agency and find out exactly what it is we're requiring and why we're requiring it. And it seems to me that, I don't see how you can go back 40 years and 30 years and say, well, we don't have a record of it, therefore it wasn't properly permitted, or therefore it was not finalized, and you've gone through several owners, and we want to do a final inspection, and we want you to pay the costs of that. So I would like to have a study session and have some discussion, and I've turned those two issues I just addressed to the board. I asked yesterday for council to take a look at those and see if they might resolve some of those issues, and so that's where it is. But I would like to have a study session and find out exactly where we're going, because we're going to find out that I think that our files have been grossly inadequate. At one point we had a fire that I think destroyed a lot of a lot of files, and I think we need to have a very clear understanding of what the requirements are going to be when somebody comes in for a building permit to just build a deck or remodel the house or whatever. I'm concerned about where we're going with this. So I would like to see if there's support to have a study session on that issue.
Well, speaking for myself, I know, I suspect that this is not new, since I myself paid for a similar fee when it was found that the house or the building had not been permitted, and this was a number of years ago, well before the current regime. So I think we've had this issue for some time, but I guess we have the community development director here to speak to this as well, but I'd like to hear from the board after that what your wishes are here.
Stephanie Moreno, Director of Community Development. I didn't hear all of the conversation. I did hear some talk about not being able to find a permit and telling people that we're assuming that they did not have a permit for a house. That's not the way we do business. We do a lot of research through the permit files. It's true that there's a lot of documentation missing. Most of the cases, it's other documentation other than the building permit itself that have been redacted out of the files over time. Although the really old permits, we do have some issues with those. It is rare that we cannot find anything on a file, because the assessor's office also keeps files, and we use them for research as well when we're having trouble. The particular case that I believe you're talking about, but I'm not positive, I did work on a very similar one to the one that you talked about, Supervisor Tryon. And the issue was that not that it was an illegal accessory dwelling, but that it was an illegal structure that had gotten permission. They had built it without a permit. And again, I don't know if this is the same one, but it's an example. They had built an accessory dwelling without a permit, and they had gotten a notice from the department back in the 90s, I believe, that they needed an accessory dwelling permit. Supervisor Tryon, I believe, was involved in the one I'm familiar with, and brought it to the department's attention that under the density rules at the time, they didn't need an accessory dwelling permit, that they were qualified to have two dwellings on the property. Unfortunately, the homeowner took that to mean they didn't have to do anything further on their property, and they never pulled the building permit for the illegal dwelling. Time went by, and the codes changed several years ago, so that in order to have an accessory dwelling on your property, it's not by density any longer. You have to actually pull a permit. Because they had never finalized or pulled a building permit for the accessory dwelling, they no longer met that exemption for the accessory dwelling, and that's why they needed to get the accessory dwelling permit. So if that's the case you're talking about, it's a little bit different than has been portrayed. We've been getting emails about it, people hearing about it. But we work very hard to find the documentation on files. In the cases where people are asked to reinstate their permits, the code requires you final your permit. It was a long-standing practice in this county that we didn't enforce that. As a consumer protection issue, it's unfair to people who buy homes that come in later to get a deck permit and they find out their house was never finalized. Not just from a financial perspective, but from a health and safety perspective, because we don't know if the final health and safety issues were ever cleared for this structure. So we require reinstatement of the permit. It's a minimal fee. In some cases, it's almost always less than $200, not always. Depends on what the status was and how long ago. There have been some as much as $1,000 to reinstate. We do the final inspection. In most cases, there's very minimal work that needs to be done. They might have to put some GFIs in or something of that nature, again, health and safety related. We close them out under the existing codes they were when they pulled the permit. It is unlikely that they will ever be required to go under a new permit unless they pulled the permit and never had any inspections, in which case it's very difficult for us to go back 20 years to an old code. But that's the current process. Staff has estimated, and I have not verified this figure, but staff has given me an estimate about a third of the residential permits in this county were unfinalized. And they're going through the files and notifying property owners because they don't want them to have a problem later on. We have had cases where people have come in to get remodeling permits and find out their entire structure, the second story, is not permitted, and then they end up having to get engineering and everything else on that, and that's just not fair to the future consumer, that we're not cleaning this up. And so that's what we've done, instituted a policy. When they come in, we don't hold up their ability to get the other permit. We run them concurrently. We tell them they need to reinstate the permit, they get the new permit, we run them concurrently. They don't have to final their house before they can get any other permits. But we've tried to work this in a very balanced way, recognizing that there are health and safety issues for many of these places that have not had the final inspections. So I can articulate, I don't think that we need a study session. I can articulate what our current policy is for you and send a report to the board, and if you feel that there's any lack of clarity in those or any inequities, I'd certainly be open to a study session, but I think it's pretty much black and white code at this point.
Well, if you could put something in writing and specify exactly what it is the current policy is, because I think we're going to get inundated if we have a third of the homes in this county have never received final inspection.
Again, that's an estimate, a rough estimate, and I can't, there's a substantiation.
I guess the question would be, should we be providing that as a courtesy, that final inspection, at this point, as opposed to charging somebody for it when the house was built 30 and 40 years ago?
The board has the right to set a waiver.
I think we should have some discussion as a board about where we're going to go with this. And it seems to me if you're going to go out, and if not you, we, the county, are going to go out and do a final inspection, it needs to be, based on the code at the time the house was built.
It is.
Today's code.
It is.
We're really going to have a mess.
No, it is, based on the code, unless they never called for a single inspection, in which case we have to.
All right, before this series of reports turns into a study session, I'm going to break in and ask whether it would satisfy you to get a written report on it.
Let's start with a written report, and then I think maybe we should have some discussion about how we're going to handle the third of the homes in the county who have never been final. I think we should really have a discussion about how do we want to go about that.
Right. If you could,
and like I said, it's going to. We don't want this to resolve into a whole lot of lawsuits, because what happens is when you sell the house, the seller has to do a disclosure statement, and one of the issues I believe on that disclosure statement today is everything, all the buildings on the property been final? Most people are just saying yes, they just assume it has. It probably was marked on the disclosure statement when they bought it, and they're marking it now, and they have no clue that 40 years ago the house wasn't final. And so I think we need to come up with some plan how we're going to do this in sort of an equitable manner, so when somebody comes in for a remodel or something where he's not just all of a sudden getting hammered with a whole bunch of fees and you have to have a new inspection or a final inspection, et cetera. If we have a third of the homes or even 10% of the homes in the county, maybe we should send out a notice saying, we've done our research, and we do not see that the home has been finalized.
Didn't you say you were doing that now?
We are doing that. Our building inspectors have been going through files and pulling those. Our clerical staff notifies the homeowners, and then they call for inspections, and our building inspection staff has been going out.
If it's over 10 years old or something, I'm not so sure we shouldn't be, or pick your date, but I'm not so sure some of these shouldn't be sort of complimentary if we've dropped the ball for 30 and 40 and 20 years on not following up.
It's the board's call.
Anyway, I'll look forward to your report.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any dates or?
So that the report says, I guess.
No, in terms of any further report?
No, excuse me, that completes my comments, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. As for me, I have a couple of meetings this week on board-appointed things, but and I guess that would be the Calaveras Child Care Council retreat and training at Greenhorn on Thursday. The group of the 4 planning committees meeting with CDA to talk about the community plans of the District 2 that are underway. The Wilseyville community meeting on Monday the 23rd. Also, there are a couple of things that have come up that I want to appraise the board of. In many other counties, there have been successful farmers markets that have been made successful primarily by their proximity to the large employers in the county. San Joaquin is like this, Ventura, Santa Barbara, Davis, and San Francisco, among others. There is a group of people who are currently in Angels Camp that are interested in expanding and beginning to have farmers market in San Andreas. And one of their thoughts about location would be that it be near where all the people are employed right here, so county site or hospital, there's more people coming to work in this immediate area than just about anywhere, and it might serve a basis for good revenues for local farmers. So I'm hoping that we might entertain that thought, and I'll be bringing that to the attention of appropriate county departments and CAO and county council as well. And secondly, I wanted to report an interesting dust-up in my district relating to different interpretations of the ADA. There are certainly, there's clarity about guide dogs in restaurants, but the issue of companion dogs in restaurants seems to be in some dispute. 2 of my constituents came to me and asked that the county clarify its position in that regard. They got a number of different messages from different departments after having been thrown out of a restaurant. So, all in my district. So I'm hoping that we might be able to get clarity. I believe there have been some Supreme Court rulings on this topic, and I'd like to make sure that all of our departments are aware of those. And that's all I have to report. Anything from our administration?
I yield to the county council.
Carol? In that case, our Board of Supervisors meeting is adjourned. Thank you for coming.
Was that companion dog a pit bull?